we're going to do a bit of a philosophical analysis of the Matrix. So how many people here have seen the Matrix? Okay, well, let me just do a brief sort of summary of the Matrix. The Matrix is made by the by Andy and Larry Wachowski, the Wachowski sisters, and it's basically with Keanu Reeves, who plays a computer programmer who leads a double life as a hacker called Neo. And after receiving cryptic messages on his computer monitor, Neo begins to search for Morpheus, who's played by Lawrence Fishburne, who is the leader of a resistance group who he believes is responsible for the messages that he gets. Eventually, Neo finds Morpheus and is then told that reality is actually very different from what he perceives it to be. Morpheus tells Neo that human existence is merely an illusion. In reality, humans are being farmed as a source of energy by a race of sentient, malevolent machines. People actually live their entire lives in pods, with their brains being fed sensory stimuli, which give them the illusion of leading ordinary lives. Morpheus explains that up until then, the reality perceived by Neo is actually a computer-generated dream world, a neural interactive simulation called the Matrix. Neo's choice between the simulated world and reality is symbolized by Morpheus's outstretched hands offering a red or blue pill. After this, there is no turning back, Morpheus says. You take the blue pill, you wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you play in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. So no sooner has he swallowed the red pill than the simulation begins to liquefy and collapse, and Neo is thrust into the realm beyond the Matrix, a biomechanical world of tubes and pods filled with gallons of ooze. Earth is a blackened husk governed by machines, which patrol the endless battery of farms of unconscious humans. Before he knows it, Neo is aboard the Nebuchadnezzar, a gravity-defying ship which Morpheus uses to search for the One, a person who will save humanity from the machines. Now, among Morpheus's crew is Cypher, who, unlike Neo, has had time to regret his decision to swallow the red pill. In fact, Cypher's disgust with the harshness of reality, which is basically a claustrophobic ship, slop for food, the constant threat of death by machine, leads him to cut a deal with the bad guys. Jacking into the Matrix, Cypher meets with Agent Smith, one of the programs that patrols the system, sniffing out the rebels, and over a particularly bloody slab of steak, agrees to sell out the crew of the Nebuchadnezzar in order to have his body plugged back into the Matrix. I want to remember nothing, Cypher says, waving a glass of wine. Nothing, you understand? And he says, this is a very famous scene. He says, I know the steak doesn't exist. I know that when I put it in my mouth, the Matrix is telling my brain that it is juicy and delicious. After 9 years, you know what I realize? Ignorance is bliss. So can anyone blame Cypher from wanting to get out of the Matrix or get out of reality and being plugged back into the Matrix? Maybe a comfortable illusion is better than an unpleasant truth, particularly when the illusion is literally indistinguishable from reality. So here's the question I just want us to talk about for a few minutes. Is a comfortable illusion better than an unpleasant truth if the illusion is literally indistinguishable from reality? So this is a philosophical question that is suggested by the Matrix. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and we can talk about it for a few minutes. And by the way, The Matrix, I think, is a film that, you know, really is philosophy through film rather than film as philosophy. I don't know if The Matrix is an original philosophical idea, but it certainly gives us a lot to think about. Bill Hollings.
I would argue that's a very common perspective in our existence. I mean, I don't mean to offend anybody here, but religion is a good example of choosing to follow a belief rather than throwing open the universe wide to looking at alternatives. Culture is another example. Again, not trying to offend anybody here. Where we stay comfortable in our cultural beliefs rather than swallowing a larger reality by looking outside our own culture and things like that. So I think it's a common element that they're communicating there.
Okay, sorry, can you elaborate on what you mean? Because I'm not sure how that's related to the question. What's that? How is that related to the question exactly?
Oh, well, you're talking about, I mean, maybe I misunderstood the question, but you were talking about the concept of is an alternative version of truth that I believe acceptable or preferred rather than the cold, harsh reality of reality, right? And I think a lot, we all create versions of truth in order to help us understand it. Now, the Matrix one is black and white. That's like, you're either digital and living a totally fake life, or you're in reality and living a totally real life. The fake life is much more pleasurable than the real life. But I'm just saying, like, that construct is very common in human adaptation to reality. Right? We create perspectives that we feel comfortable in, even though they may be disconnected from objective reality.
I think the philosophical nature of this question has to do with if you could plug yourself into some illusory reality, but which is very pleasurable but isn't real. Okay, now you can argue that every reality has its own reality, even one that's not real. So this is what you said before. The Matrix is a different kind of reality, but it's still real. But the question here is, let's say that it's an illusory reality. Let's assume that the Matrix is not real. It's an illusion, and it's not an illusion that gives you something. It takes away something human from you. Would you prefer to have the pleasure of an illusion rather than having the true human reality, which may be a lot harsher, like being in the real world, being yourself, not being in a vat, not being in a Matrix reality, being in a real place, but that place is not necessarily pleasant? Would you rather have that than a pleasant but unreal sort of reality that gives you pleasure all the time?
Yeah, I guess I was arguing that there are many cases in life where we do exactly that, where we create a fake reality, let's say, because it's more acceptable to us, and it gives us peace and more tasty to us than alternatives.
Yeah, well, listen, I mean, we do that with self-delusion too.
Yeah.
Not just by plugging ourselves into some sort of a matrix. Look, I mean, people who spend a lot of their time on their smartphones, on social media, are sort of doing the same thing. They're plugging in to escape from something.
Right.
Oh, it goes back to Plato's cave too. I mean, Plato says we'd have to the prisoner released would have to be dragged, screaming and kicking into the light because he'd prefer what's comfortable.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess the other aspect of, I mean, you mentioned cell phones. We create these virtual personalities, these virtual characters through social media profiles, avatars, etc.
Yeah, no, for sure, for sure. Okay, let's move on. Rick, what have you got for us?
I think a lot of this stuff that's in the Matrix, a lot of it comes from the writing of Philip Dick more than anyone else, because he was exploring all this stuff about what's real and what's not real, and what's drug real and real back in the 60s and 50s even. And I know a lot of his stuff and now is very popular now, is about, I don't know how many movies and TV shows are based on his stuff now.
Yeah.
Considering the poor guy died broke, but hey.
Yeah, I think there's a
A
show
lot
on,
of philosophy in his books. I mean, they were
Yeah.
very strange to read back in the 60s.
yeah. I think there's a show on Amazon called The Peripheral that is actually based on one of his ideas of virtual worlds versus real worlds. Anyway, interesting. Randy.
Yeah, I find your question, Ronen, leads to something what I think is interesting. First of all, I would think that the question you raised is a very subjective one, independent or really dependent upon the individual, and we get into an ethical issue here that if the self-delusion actually affects other people, for example, you self-delude that theft is good, then I think it definitely becomes immoral. So that's the ethical issue. And in the one you described with the Matrix, whether he decided to go with the blue pill or return to the Matrix or not, the real problem there was that he was selling out the crew. So that was the immorality. But what I find interesting, if we just look at it as subjective, right? Individual, whatever you believe, it's not affecting anybody else. To me, it raises an interesting issue of, do you have an ethical responsibility to yourself? And that, to me, I find a more fascinating question on how you would resolve that one. And that, to me, would be part of what you ultimately decided to do.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, Randy. You're saying that Cypher, even though he's going to be plugged into this pleasurable matrix, he's abnegating some responsibility he has to himself to be a real human being, not just some battery in a vat. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying in the first instance, he is violating the morality by selling out his crew.
Yes.
So the self-delusion has an ethical component that if you are going to take the subjective approach, it cannot have an immoral or an ethical problem cannot create an ethical issue for other people. And then it becomes strictly subjective. For example, you could take religion. You could take a religious aspect that you decide you need to proselytize the whole thing, and you can see what can happen when that gets going. You only have to look to the Middle East. Or you can take it that God is very personal belief. And I would say that's subjective. But then to take any particular subjective perspective, I would argue is, what is your ethical responsibility to yourself?
Mhm.
And so, we can judge that, but should we judge it? I think that's the parameters I would suggest for using when you make the decision, but I'm not so sure that we outside of the individual can make a judgment either way on that, on what they decide to do.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic because, I'm sorry, I'll make myself visible. That's a very interesting question because what morality do we owe ourselves? So for instance, if living in a dreamlike world makes me happier, aren't I morally obligated to make myself happier versus am I morally obligated to know the truth,
But I guess the bigger question there is, are you giving up something by plugging into a virtual world? And so this is where the philosophy comes in. And, we can have that discussion, and it may not be an easy discussion. There's certainly a lot of reasons to plug into a place where you feel pleasurable, where you can be famous and wanted and attractive, and you can get it whatever it is that you want whenever you want it. there's an argument to be made for that. But is there an argument to be made for not plugging in and living in a much harsher reality, but maintaining your humanity, not just being some virtual thing that exists in something that isn't really real? It's just, determined for you. So one of the things you lose is your freedom, right? If you are plugged in, you're not really making free choices anymore. You're simply part of a program. So are you willing to give up your autonomy and just be programmed by some computer AI that will sort of create a life for you? Or is it better for you to create your own life?
Yeah, but the interesting part about the Matrix is you wouldn't know the difference. You'd still think you had free will.
You might know, that's right, but that's why it's a thought experiment, right? It's
Absolutely.
asking you to imagine what, and asking you to make a choice. What would you choose? Yes, and that's actually one of the central key ideas there, that you don't know. Once you're plugged in, you don't know that you're plugged in anymore.
Right.
And that's key. I mean, if you knew, then the whole thought experiment, the whole thing would not really make any sense anymore. But it's the fact that you don't know that really makes it potent.
It's interesting that in the Matrix, the alternate lives they're living are messy lives, just like we live now. For instance, we're not all sitting in vibrating chairs being fed chocolates by
That's
somebody.
true. That's true.
Neil works at a grunge job.
Yeah.
People are still getting presumably
That's-
hit by cars and stuff like that.
That's
So,
that. No, that is very true. And in the Matrix, they do say that they tried to give people whatever they wanted, and they just became very passive, and they just wouldn't give them the power, the energy. Like they weren't good batteries anymore. So they had to make them. They had to make life difficult for them, and to generate some real passion, I guess, or energy from the people in the vat. Anyway, many, and then we're going to go on because we have more to present. But I think we're going to, because there's so much more. I'm just going to move on very quickly. I'm going to let Meaghan present, and then we're going to sort of cap it off. But Manny, you go on with your point. No, you gotta unmute.
Yes. I'm struck by, well, obviously, illusion is functional, but I'm struck with the way we're discussing it, where it's illusion to that's kind of good and pleasurable, and no illusion is painful. Right? It's like between pain and pleasure, right? I just something I've observed in our discussion. I don't know if that's always the case, right? That's one
Sorry.
observation.
Sorry, I kind of missed the point. Can you explain that again?
The point is that illusion obviously is functional, right? Like I think Bill said, right? We all have them, we all use them, right? And because the premise is that the reality is more painful, so we use illusion to kind of feel better. I should speak on I, not we. Then I use illusion to feel better. But I'm struck that it's always the choice between an ugly or unpleasant reality and a more pleasant illusion, right? Is that always the case?
Well, that is a good point. I think that in this particular case, it's that. So the Matrix is better than the alternative. It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternative. So the question of whether it's always the illusion is better than the reality is a good question. And in fact, if you look at the question of what would you rather have, being plugged into a false reality that's more pleasant than the real reality. Well, maybe experiencing pain in the real reality ultimately is better than experiencing the pleasure or whatever it is that you get from the false reality. It's a perspective. I mean, you might say as a human being, I would much rather experience the pain and be real than have some pleasure or, you know, have less pain in the illusion, but not really be myself, you know? So that's where the philosophy is.
On the other hand, in the Matrix, Neo is a low-level clerk, you know, having trouble with life kind of thing, just getting by. Outside the Matrix, in the real world, he is a superhero, right?
That's true.
I don't mean like the later movies where he actually really is a superhero, but he's fighting the good fight, right? He's got a purpose in life now and things like that. So
That's
that's
true.
a case where he may be, sure, the food tastes gross, but hey, the rest of my life is full of energy and full of charge and purpose,
Yeah.
right?
And then you make a great point, because for Neo, the real world is actually a much better place than the illusion of the Matrix. For Cypher, the illusion of the Matrix is a much better place than the real world, because he's sick and tired of the real world where he's constantly fighting for his life. So to some extent, I guess it's based on your own personal perspective and who you are as a human being, what you choose to take as the better reality. Yeah. Anyway, I think we should move on now. Let me just share the screen again. Now, Meaghan was going to talk about film as philosophy. Meaghan, I suggest that we do that, and then just I'm going to completely skip the section on film as a thought experiment, because I think that that's going to be too much. So let's just go with yours, and then we can open up the floor for the rest of the time for any discussion.